Hey everyone, Stuart here. Just wanted to jump in before we start this week's show, just to let you know about the event I've got coming up on the 29th of March up in Edinburgh. Beautiful city. If you haven't been, I highly recommend. I've got the Talent Equation Live. It's a new experiment in learning, which I've been fortunate enough to be able to put on with the support of the fabulous PE staff at Stuart Melville's College. I'll be joined by some of the guests who've come on the podcast in the past: John Fletcher, Rusty Earnshaw, Sarah Kelleher, Danny Newcombe, and Mark Bennett. We're all going to be there. We're going to be working together, delivering sessions and also getting practical and getting hands-on and giving everybody an opportunity to spend time doing some question and answers and working through the problems that you're facing with your own coaching. So if you are hoping to get some learning, it's really good value, and it promises to be a really, really fantastic day. So I'm hoping to see you there. If you're interested in running even a mini community of learning event, a workshop, or actually putting on a big conference like Talent Equation Live, and you're interested in hosting one, then drop me a line over on the contact pages on the website, and we can start a conversation about that. And I'd really, really like to talk to you about that, because I think getting out there and being able to speak to people and meet people is probably one of the best ways in which we can continue this fantastic movement in coaching and skill acquisition and learning and development, and inspiring young people to have a life in sport. So I look forward to seeing you in Edinburgh if you can. If not, I'll look forward to hearing from you in due course. Anyway, on with this week's show.
Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, now I've got a treat today. This is something we've been trying to do for a little while. We had some technological issues, but we're getting going. Anastacia Long has joined me on the podcast. Anastacia, welcome to the Talent Equation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Absolute pleasure. As I often with this, with the opening to this podcast, sort of we obviously kind of crossed paths in my time when I was working at the RFU a few times, and have crossed paths subsequently. But you've got you've got a really interesting story about your journey in this whole crazy world of coaching. So I wonder if you can go back as far as you like, really, around whole sport and what got you into it. But, or you can just start from, your coaching journey in rugby or whatever it is. But just take us back to the beginning, really, wherever that feels right.
Okay, well, I started life as a highboard diver, and I had a career-ending injury when I was about 16 and got into coaching that way. So started coaching some sort of just average club divers who then progressed through to nationals and some junior international club competitions. I kind of got the coaching bug, I suppose, then, in terms of wanting to work with young athletes and enjoying being able to put something back into sport. And I actually think I preferred being in the coaching role rather than the performing role. And I then, as part of my rehabilitation,
before you move on from that, I hate to interrupt, but you just kind of flew straight past highboard diving, right? So you're one of those lunatics who go 10 meters up in the air, on the concrete thing, and then spin backwards and land in a pool.
Yeah, sometimes gracefully, other times averagely. And you know about it when it's average.
Okay, well, so let's. Yeah, I bet you do. It's not one of those. It's a pretty unforgiving, unforgiving sport.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where I know we talk a lot in rugby about kind of how you provide feedback. Hitting the water wrong, it gives you pretty instant feedback.
So that's like the mother lode of implicit feedback there.
Yes, yeah. You can generally tell how well it's gone before you see your coach's face when you come up from the water. Your body's giving you a pretty good idea of that first.
If you come up from the water and everybody's just got this like look on the face, like, oh,
yeah, or they're just in hysterics. Yeah.
That might be something we have to circle back to, because I'd be really interested to some of your experiences, both as a diver and as a coach in that sport. But anyway, I did interrupt. Please continue.
No problem. So had quite a lot of physio from my injury, and just decided that actually I think physio was something I quite enjoyed as well. So I did an advanced sports therapy diploma, which allowed me to go and work at my local rugby club as their first team physio. And I met my now husband, who was coaching the first team, and I kind of ended up, I suppose, doing a little bit of coaching through being the physio. I'd run on with messages that I had absolutely no idea what they meant. It was the sort of first time I'd really watched rugby, and I quite enjoyed it, and I got involved in the team. Coming from a diving background, it was really nice to be in a team environment. Diving was quite an isolating, an individual sport, certainly. So it was really different vibe, being with a group of lads and going on their journey with them. And I at around a similar time started working at Graveney, which was my first sort of main teaching role that I got. And ironically, I was there to teach trampolining, because obviously trampolining was a massive part of our diving training. We used to do a lot of dryland training. So that was why I was at Graveney. I was employed to do trampolining, a bit of netball, a bit of tennis, and so on. And after I'd been there a couple of years, a young lad called Carl Sinclair came and approached me and said, "Oh, Miss, could we have a school rugby team?" And I'm sure most people know that kind of his involvement in the sport came from playing at his local rugby club, being picked up by Colin Osborne at Harlequins and getting into the academy. And we then did some rugby at school, which he was quite pivotal in helping me get off the ground. There was about 3 or 4 others that played rugby outside of school, and then for the rest, it was just this sport that none of them had ever seen, they'd never watched. They had no idea of the concept of running forwards, passing backwards, staying behind the ball. Most of them were footballers, athletes, and that kind of thing.
So just on that,
mm-hmm.
describe the school to me a little bit around the kind of area, the demographics, the kind of kids that go there, all that sort of stuff.
It was a big mixed secondary school. So we were about 2,000 pupils, very small school site. So we only had about a 30 by 40 metre bit of grass that by October was flooded and didn't unflood until about May. So that was pretty much a no-go. And just a school full of athletes, I suppose. It was a mixed environment in terms of it was partially selective. So there were some children there who were very academic, and then there was others who got in on a catchment area, and they didn't have to take a test or anything. So a really brilliant mix of pupils from all different kind of backgrounds. The actual location of the school was in Tooting, and pupils came from the local areas. Some of them had had an easier start in life than others. Some had to overcome significant kind of adversity that they probably shouldn't have gone through by the age they were. But sport was everything in that school. For most of those children, sport was a lifeline for them in terms of it was what they were good at, and therefore the positive relationships that they had with their peers and with staff were generally revolved around their involvement in sport. And I really felt like it was an opportunity to kind of tap into those children and potentially offer them an opportunity to go down a different route than they might otherwise have gone down. And obviously rugby is certainly a sport where they could let off some steam. They kind of looked at me as if they didn't really believe me when I said, yeah, you can, within the laws of the game, do anything you like to try and stop an opposition player. And you can imagine some of the requests I got for what their suggestions might have been. But we actually, I suppose, got a pretty decent rugby programme set up there by just engaging in engaging children who really wanted to play sport, a lot of children who just wanted to get out of afternoon lessons. So I can't hide that fact. We used to leave at lunchtime because we had to play on pitches that didn't have floodlights and stuff. So to miss afternoon lessons and to get to wear a smart kit and things like that was cool. The smart kit that we had was great, but we only had one. So it was worn by the year 7s, the under 12s, as well as the sixth formers. So anyone in between was pretty much okay, but if you were at either end of that spectrum, then it was either a trench coat or a crop top. So it was interesting seeing some of those guys running out, but actually they didn't know any different and I didn't know any different, and we muddled along, and all I did was sort of try to stay one step ahead of them. And Kyle was instrumental in getting that started, and we just got boys that were very athletic, who sort of had the physical capacity to play, and then boys that were sort of multi-sport, so the ones who you knew would make good decisions based on what they saw in front of them, and it all kind of came together that way.
Wow. Now I know there's more in the story, but it is probably worth just pausing there for a second. So for those people who aren't aware who Kyle Sinclair is, he is a current England international prop forward and an extremely adept rugby player. Also played for the Lions. So, for those people who aren't necessarily all that au fait with rugby, that is a significant accolade that very few rugby players actually get, is to be a Lion and to wear a Lions jersey. How old was he when he came to you saying, we want to start a rugby team, or I want to start a rugby team?
He was 13 at the time.
So he was 13 and he was a bit, and is it fair to say from what you are describing to me that basically he was a bit like your assistant coach almost in terms of setting this whole program up? Yeah,
I think he sort of said in no uncertain terms, you drive the bus, you arrange the fixtures, fill up some water bottles for us, and I'll do the rest. And that was kind of how it was. Yeah. I can't take a huge amount of credit, if I'm honest, because my knowledge of rugby at the time was pretty minimal. He used to sort of, we used to have really good chats, I suppose, about, well, why don't we put so and so in the team? And the boys would often tell me if somebody had kind of had a really outstanding performance in the football team, or somebody had won an athletics race, oh, you've got to get so and so in the team. And we did. We just tried various things out, and he actually played fly half for us, because he just decided he was going to make the decisions and decide what was going to happen. And if worse came to worst, he knew he'd be getting his hands on the ball first, and would just kind of try and demolish as many of the other team as he could to get us nearer the try line, and hopefully somebody else would finish it. Was he the same sort of shape when he was 13 as he is? Yeah, he probably wasn't quite as athletic as he is now. He was a similar frame. He always had kind of bundles of energy, which we tried to steer in the right direction. But he insisted on wearing the 10 shirt, which was easier to get on than it was to get off him, I think, at the end. And it always amused the others in the team. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, because ordinarily the standard, I suppose, shape of a 10 is usually fairly wiry, isn't it? And they're deemed, and obviously Kyle's a very different kind of physiological animal than that, certainly now. But interesting, isn't it? Because actually that's one of the interesting things about... so when he was playing outside of the school environment, I'm assuming he was having to play in a different position. So his school context, he was able to kind of run the show and be the 10 and do all that sort of stuff. But I imagine when he was in either some of the early stage academy work that he was involved in, or in the club stuff, I imagine he was in a different role. Was that right?
Yeah, I think anyone with any rugby knowledge, so that just was everybody other than me, would probably have just gone, you're a prop, in you go. And I think, I'm not sure what position he played every game at club. Certainly the times that I watched him play for club, he was playing at prop. And I think Harlequins obviously saw him with a future at prop. But certainly with us, he had a bit of a free rein, I suppose. There were times where if we weren't winning scrums, he would just go and put himself at prop just to win us the ball. And so it was quite fluid. We had absolutely no structure and absolutely no team calls or set moves or anything like that. So it was just a free for all, and it was a bit kind of play what you see and do whatever you like, really.
So, I mean, one of the interesting things about that, I think, is, and it seems to be there's some similar stories, because Tom Youngs, who obviously for a long time was the England hooker, played as a centre, as a kind of as a youth rugby player, and I think this is becoming increasingly common, because I think as the game's now evolved and developed, and you want, traditionally, you kind of, particularly your front row, your props were there really just to basically put their head into rucks and recycle the ball. Really carrying the ball wasn't seen as being that important. But nowadays, the ability for prop forwards to be able to carry the ball effectively and make decisions and handle the ball and be able to make passes is really, really important. So it's kind of interesting to see how he was able to play in those key decision-making areas and play in those ways, because that certainly comes through when you watch him play now. He's way, way more than just a kind of a unit of a player who basically just barrels through things. He's making decisions. He's got great hands. He creates for others. I mean, I've seen him make some absolutely fantastic breaks for other people, and some of his offload play is really quite exceptional. So it's quite interesting to see how that experience, I'm not saying it was necessarily that experience alone that was formative, but you can see how he had those capabilities, and that is quite a unique skill set.
Yeah, I think certainly at the time, my knowledge of the game was just the real basics, I suppose. That I think that probably the most positive impact I had on him as I use it in the loosest term, his school coach, was that I just didn't constrain him in any way, because I didn't know what he should have been doing. So he had absolute free reign, and I get that he would have made mistakes, but the only person who would have pulled him up on that would have been himself, and he would have learnt through trying something, it not working, and thinking, oh, better try something different. He didn't have anybody kind of giving him the answers. He didn't have anybody telling him what he should and shouldn't be doing. The instructions from the sideline were from me, just in terms of effort and enjoyment and keeping everybody involved, and hopefully through having, I suppose, quite naive teammates from certainly the inexperienced players, he would have had to come up with ways of solving problems, such as, how do I get those guys involved in the game? And I know I've got somebody who can run 100 metres in under 11 seconds on the wing. How do I get them the ball and get them the ball in the right place? And I think that probably served all of them quite well, in terms of, there was no one else giving them the answers, and there was no one even sort of setting them any problems other than the opposition. And fundamentally, I think that's where coaching is and should be now, in terms of coaches have got to realise that if they're barking instructions at players during really structured training sessions, and they've got cones laid everywhere, and they've got an image in their head of what they want, and they're going to get those players to do what they want come what may, actually, if it doesn't look like what they're going to look at on the pitch, then it's generally those same coaches that are standing on the sidelines, like tearing their hair out, thinking, why are those players not making those decisions? Why are those players not seeing what I'm seeing? And it's because they've never had to. It's because they've never been in a position where they've had to work it out themselves, or they've had to solve a problem kind of in real time, live in a game, where they know that they haven't got a training session or an analysis session or a coach who's going to kind of give them the answers afterwards. They really were kind of almost just on their own. I was there to just drive the minibus and fill up the water bottles. So hopefully, kind of reflecting on that now, I would say that was probably my biggest contribution to all of them, was that at that stage, I just, in no way were they constrained. They were just allowed to do whatever they wanted, and if they won because they'd made the right decisions, or they'd kind of outwitted their opponent. And I think that must have been great for them, certainly from an enjoyment perspective. I think they must have loved it.
Well, let's talk about that, because you decided after a year or so, I suppose, of being on this crazy journey, that you were going to enter one of the premium rugby competitions for schools in the country. Did you not?
It was a few years later, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah.
So you'd been doing this for a while, yeah. So
yeah.
But anyway, you decided to enter this competition, and what happened next?
So we decided to enter the NatWest at under 15. It was the year group that I was actually coaching at my club. So I'd been involved with those guys since under 11. And again, it was at that very early stage. My husband just said, look, you've got the delivery skills as the teacher. I've played rugby all my life. I'll kind of let you know what's going on, and then we can decide what we're going to kind of pass on to the boys. And so again, the coaching was quite liberal, I suppose, at that young age. But the boys were all playing outside school together. And that was something that we'd done from a school perspective and a club perspective, I suppose, was we had no training opportunities. We had no facilities to practice on. So getting those boys to play club rugby was the only way that they had any opportunity to kind of play together, play matches, get some experience. So those guys had, bar one or two, the boys in that year group had never touched a rugby ball before they joined secondary school. So they were 11 when they started playing rugby, and most of them were 14 turning 15 when they did the NatWest. So their training age was about maximum sort of 3-4 years old. Some of them who played in that NatWest tournament had only started playing rugby that season, so that September. And I suppose it was, for me, it was an opportunity to not have to go out there looking for fixtures. I thought, great, we can enter it. We can enter a competition where they will just tell me who our next opposition is, and off we'll go. So we entered it, and I had very little clue what the competition was really about. I didn't know that the finals were at Twickenham, or what kind of journey we would end up going on. And the boys knew even less than me. So they just thought, we're playing in a cup. They would do the same for the school football team and that kind of thing. And so off we went. And the way the tournament works is the majority of your kind of first round matches are fairly local. We started kind of getting matches further and further away as the rounds went on. And yeah, we went on a pretty exciting journey and got to the Vars final. We got knocked out in the third round of the cup, which was fortunate because none of us had a clue that if we'd lost any later than that, that's it, we would have been out. So we got knocked out of the cup and went into the Vars, and went on a journey that saw us play at Allianz Park in the quarter-final and semi-final, and then play at Twickenham in the final.
And in so doing, knocking out some decent names in the world of schools rugby.
Yeah, I think when the boys look back on it, I think the game that they thought was kind of their best performance, if an outsider was looking in, was probably in that third round match that we lost. We went over to Whitgift, and yeah, they were a school that the boys had really looked up to, and obviously knew was a big rugby playing school. And I think the final score was 29-26. And previous to that, we'd played some of the independent schools when they were a little bit younger. They were mainly the opposition that we tried to get because they had their own pitches. It was easy to get to. The boys loved the fact that they got a meal afterwards or a bit of tea, and but we'd only ever played B or C teams. We'd gone over on a games afternoon. So to come up against a full A team and to get them really kind of held close at the end, I think the boys were really, really proud of that. And then going forward, we had some close games. We had some games where we were probably more dominant than we expected to be, and in doing so played some fantastic schools, some fantastic opposition. We received amazing support along the way from everybody, and it was a pretty dreamy journey.
Culminating in essentially getting to the finals day at Twickenham, and then I guess at that point you got, I think it was, to get to semis.
We got to the final.
The final, right?
We lost 12-10 in the final.
12-10.
I think for me, and most people don't know this story because at the time it was incredibly raw, and it was incredibly difficult for me as a coach, for us as a school body, and particularly for the boys. But we won our quarter-final, and obviously knew we were going to be playing in the semi-final. And that, I think, was the first time when the school really realised, because you've got to remember that Graveney as a school had no history of playing rugby, and that the staff were kind of as naive as I were in terms of what the what rugby looked like from a wider perspective amongst independent schools and things. It wasn't until we got to the semi-final that we kind of realised, actually, this is a pretty big tournament here, and we're going to a pretty nice stadium to play, and there's going to be some people watching. And we had St George's College Weybridge in the semi-final, and I suppose a little side story to that is Mark Crean, who was the director of rugby at the time, was going to be my sort of opposite number. And ironically, when we'd gone to the Surrey Sevens tournament with Kyle's year group a few years before, he was the only person at that tournament that knew the real reason why I didn't referee that day. So I basically turned up and was horrified to see that Graveney were listed on about four matches as having to referee, and there I was on my own with this group of boys, and I couldn't possibly have told you more than half a dozen rules of rugby at the time. And I just thought, oh my God, we're at the under 16 Surrey Sevens, and I don't even know the rules. So our first game was against St George's, and so I met this lovely, friendly Irish guy who came over. He shook my hand. He really made me feel welcome. And I said to him, "I'm really sorry, but I actually don't know the rules, and so I'm not going to be able to referee." So I told everybody else that day that I was injured, and that's why I wasn't going to be able to referee. And he very kindly stepped up and refereed all the matches I was supposed to be refereeing. So it was really ironic, actually, that he was sort of one of the first people I'd met in rugby, and then we ended up against each other in the semi-final. So there was a really nice kind of existing relationship there, and we'd been over to St George's a few times with various year groups to play. And so we had this date in our diary. We knew the match was coming up. We were going to be travelling to stay the night in a hotel the night before. And we were going on the Friday, and the match was on the Saturday. And there was about 8 boys in that year group who were all in the same class. And very, very sadly, the Thursday evening, their form tutor passed away very suddenly, very unexpectedly, and he'd been due to come and watch the boys play. And as a member of staff, I was good friends with this guy, and we only found out on the Friday morning. And so we had that big dilemma of the coaches coming to pick us up at about midday. Are we going to tell the boys? They knew something was wrong. Everybody knew something was wrong, because there were a number of staff members who were having to go home. They were having to leave, and they just couldn't process the news that none of us had found out until that morning. So it was a real dilemma. I sat down with the head and the principal, and we decided that we had to tell the boys. We had to let them know. But obviously I was then going to be on my own looking after them that evening at the hotel, and we had no idea how they were going to react and how they were going to respond, and particularly, did they still want to play the match the next day? So that was a really difficult thing for us, and the boys found it particularly difficult. It was a very emotional evening that evening. I think it was probably good that they were there together and they were there as a team, because I think they did an awful lot of kind of grieving together that night. It certainly wasn't the kind of preparation that you would ever imagine doing before the biggest game of their lives, and certainly one that I suppose came with a bit of added pressure, because we were this kind of unknown school that had started to attract a bit of attention, and people were looking at this as a bit of a story of this state school, this inner London state school that had got to this stage of the competition. And actually, what all of us wanted was to just crawl into a dark room and for everything to disappear, and for this match not to be happening. And it was almost like the last thing on our minds. So we spoke to the organisers. I remember phoning Mark Lowe and saying to him, I'm not sure that the boys are going to be able to play, but let's play it by ear. So it was a very low-key evening. And then the following day, a couple of the boys came and spoke to me, and they just said, look, we think Sir's still going to be watching us. We want to do this. We want to do this for him, and we're going to go out and play, and we're going to play our best. And so the organisers were amazing. They didn't kind of interview us before the game or anything. They just let us get on with our preparation. We actually did our own minute silence, because we thought getting everybody in Allianz Park to do a minute silence would just almost kind of break the boys, I suppose, that they wouldn't be able to cope with that. So we did our own little huddle. We talked about how we had the benefit of the 16th man who was going to be there watching us and cheering us on. And I think it just put a fire in the boys' belly that I just didn't know was there. And that's, to see that kind of burning desire for me is the epitome of that resilience that we look for in our kids and our players. And for those that might have been faltering, they had a player on either side of them that was just going to put their arm around them and just carry them with them. And it was a really poignant moment, I suppose, but a particularly emotional game, because not only did we kind of suddenly realise, wow, we're now going to Twickenham, but for us it wasn't the joyful kind of celebration that maybe other schools might have had, because we knew we were going back to memorial assemblies and to ultimately to a funeral, and that was obviously quite difficult. But from a team perspective, I think for the boys to come through that was such a massive experience for them, not only as rugby players but for human beings as well. And I know that he's obviously not forgotten, and the boys valued him so much as a form tutor and as a teacher, and we did as colleagues. But that really kind of, it was a hurdle that none of us were expecting to get over, and I had no idea how they were going to respond, and I'd never been in that situation myself. I'd never taken such a big group of young people through a kind of grieving process, but rugby kind of saved them, I suppose. And a lot of them said afterwards, we know Sir would want us to carry on, we know Sir would want to see us do well at school, and it just almost kind of gave them a renewed focus, I suppose, about what they were doing and how short life could be, and let's take every opportunity that we get with both hands. And they did, and they kind of really benefited from that.
And just to put that into perspective as well, I mean, that is something probably a lot of people don't know about. So, and I've often described your story as it should be a movie. And by the way, I'm buying the rights right now. But even with that bit as well, I mean, that's like an added dimension that like nobody understands. All we know is, there's this, like you say, inner city London school who've gone on this fantastic journey. Who knew how fantastic it was, and the highs and lows that they've absolutely had to go through. I mean, I can imagine there's many other stories about the individuals involved and the kids involved, and they've all got, like you say, various things going on outside of their school life, outside of their sporting life that they have to deal with. So, that is like obviously one very, very major one, but there's lots of other bits and pieces happening all the time. But like St George's College, Weybridge, I mean, if anyone's been there, I mean, I used to coach there as well when I was doing the hockey stuff down there. I mean, that is when you go to that place, it's like, good Lord, the facilities, the buildings, it's a place to be, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was, I suppose, one of the best things about being a state school and getting to experience those facilities, and we felt privileged to be able to play on those pitches and in those facilities. But it was always my biggest bugbear as a coach, because I would always sort of say at half time to the boys, right, what do we think we're doing well? What do we think we need to work on? And then I used to say, and has anyone got any questions? Is anyone unsure of anything? And without fail, someone would ask, Miss, what food are we getting after the game? And I was just thinking, oh, there we go. There it is. So when I thought there they were busy focusing, they were just waiting for the hot food afterwards.
And in fairness, having, some of those schools, I mean, they really pride themselves on how well they feed their opposition, don't they? I mean, they really put a song and a dance about it. There's quite a bit of a, after a game, between schools, there's a bit of a, there's presentation-y type stuff, and people say a few words, and it's quite some production, really, isn't it? Which I imagine was quite an eye-opener for the kids as well.
Yeah, they got to meet some really lovely boys. All of the boys we played against, they always made us feel so welcome. The staff sort of almost appreciated maybe that we didn't have what they had, and therefore they were just going to kind of really put on a bit of a show for us in terms of, look boys, this is what rugby is, this is what the values are. And the one, my biggest criticism, I suppose, of the wider media is I feel like independent schools get a huge amount of criticism, and they're often seen to be quite aloof, and a lot of people look at them and think, oh, you sit in your ivory tower and that kind of thing. But what people never really kind of get told, or the stories that are never publicised enough for me, just how incredible independent schools are at the opportunities that they give and the help that they provide to local state schools. And they don't make a song and dance about it because they do it for the right reasons. They're doing it because they know it's the right thing to do. And a lot of them feel that it's kind of spreading that rugby message, and that's the ethos of rugby. And so many of those independent schools, they gave us so much. They provided us with opportunities that we wouldn't have otherwise had. They treated us as equals, that no one ever looked down on us. We were always made to feel so welcome. And if we played really well, they would be the first ones to come and congratulate us. And for boys from a potentially quite a different background, I think that really changed their opinions of kind of maybe different social different people on different parts of the social ladder, and that broke down an awful lot of barriers where potentially boys who'd had quite an underprivileged or a disadvantaged background might have looked at their peer who was at an independent school and maybe from an affluent background, and it definitely changed their opinion of them. And for me, that was what made rugby such an inclusive sport for them that they'd never experienced before. And without that, and without what those schools do, and without some of the kind of characters that you've got in rugby who look beyond social class, who look beyond social situations and family situations, and everybody in rugby feels an equal, that for me is what allowed so many of those boys to be very successful. Lots of them went on to represent the Harlequins Academy. 5 of them played in the under-18 Premiership final for Harlequins through the Elite Player Development Group, and those boys would never have had that opportunity had they not felt like they fitted in. And so I suppose my big bugbear with some of the media is that they say a lot of these schools are greedy and they've got loads of money, and actually they do a lot of good with it. And my boys would not be where they are now and would not have had the experiences that they had they not interacted and had those opportunities provided by those independent schools. And that for me is something that is so important for, I don't know, school coaches, club coaches, is just to kind of understand the demographic and understand the child that you're dealing with. Just get to know them, find out what their difficulties are, find out what their barriers to participation might be. And then the rugby community for me has never ever failed in helping somebody that needs help, whether that's an adult player who is out of work and somebody steps up and says, oh yeah, my company will give you a job, or whether that's somebody who is a child who's maybe got no access to boots, got no access to transport. All of those things are provided for in rugby because there's so many people who are willing to help others. And as coaches, if you know your kids really, really well, you'll know when things aren't right. You'll know when they need a bit of extra support. You know when they need help. And that's the biggest thing you can afford to them as a coach. At Graveney, I didn't produce rugby players. I just produced kids who wanted to be involved in sport, who understood when an opportunity was presented to them, who had that kind of thirst for learning and thirst for, if an opportunity arises, I'm going to take it. And that's I think the biggest thing you can offer as a coach is get those kids wanting to be involved, enjoying what they're doing, believing that there's a future for them, and believing there's a place for them in your team, in your club, in the wider sport in general, even if that ends up being as a coach or a referee like I ended up becoming. It's so important, because for some people, and you won't know this potentially until later on, for some of them it's life-changing. And I just think that's such a valuable lesson, and it's something that I would say is the biggest lesson I've learned from coming from that background, is just never underestimate what people are going through in their personal lives. Or we hit it really well. No one would have known in that semi-final that anything was wrong, yet inside everything was wrong. For those kids, their world had been ripped apart. 8 of those 22, that guy was their form tutor, and he was the first person they saw every morning. He saw them every lunchtime. He was their pastoral support, and all of a sudden he was just gone. And so it's having that support network and providing that help for those people that can be so key, and that can be what keeps them in a sport. It can make them feel like they belong, that's, I suppose, the biggest thing I'm proud of when I think like that I represent rugby.
It's interesting because, like they say, you talk about the media, they don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. And I was just thinking, having bought the rights to the movie, obviously when I write the screenplay, then it's just going to, I want to make it a bit more sensational, don't I? So I'm obviously going to characterize the opposing coaches and the opposing kids as being really horrible and nasty and looking down on everybody else. Because then, of course, our heroes, when they, kind of achieve what they achieve, it's far more emotive and it's stronger. But like you say, one of the things that, in the time I felt very privileged to work, actually, get paid, if you like, for the privilege of working in the sport of rugby for England Rugby. And one of the things that struck me, having worked in a range of different sports and coached in a range of different sports, is that thing that you've just brought out there. There is something about the rugby community. I'm not saying it's unique, but there is definitely something about the game itself and the people involved where, like you say, things like social class melt into the background, because the vast majority of teams are made up of people from a range of different backgrounds, and there's something about I think the inherent dangers involved in the game, whereby in some cases you are reliant on others, not only for success in the game, but sometimes for your own personal safety. And having played prop forward, very, very inexperienced prop forward at the age of 17, without the physical capabilities, I sure as eggs is eggs relied on Giffo and Elmo, my two props, for protection in some cases, because the only reason I was playing prop forward because I played some American football, and the only reason I was playing hooker was because I played some American football and I could throw the ball a long way to our backs, and then they could run through and score tries because we knew our forwards were very good, and because I was in the forwards. That tells you everything about what you need to know about that. Anyway, so I mean, amazing story. I mean, and just to kind of contextualize this for everybody as well, you mentioned you played kind of like Whitgift in the third round, and they beat you by 3 points. I mean, Whitgift are one of the teams who you would expect. I mean, it's like one of the biggest rugby schools in the country, really, really strong tradition of rugby, would have more than likely, I imagine, gone on to get to the semis themselves in that year, would they have not?
Yeah, I think they did actually. I think they got to the semi-finals in the cup.
And you've gone out to them in the third round by 3 points. I imagine that was a little bit of a shock to the system for them, was it? Were they not expecting that?
Yeah, I don't think they were expecting it, to be honest. I think what I've probably learned now in my years of coaching following that is you can coach your team to be the best they can possibly be based on how you want them to play and what you want your play to look like. But what you can't do is you can't know what the opposition are going to bring. And actually our biggest strength was actually what all the things that we didn't have. So what ended up being our strength was the fact that the boys weren't overcoached, so they just played what was ahead of them. We didn't have any set moves, so when a sort of quite organised and structured side kind of look and think, oh, I wonder what's coming next, our lot were just standing wherever they'd got up from or wherever they fancied standing based on what they were thinking at the time. And we ended up being kind of very difficult to defend against because we didn't do the expected. Most teams tend to kick out of their 22. We didn't have any, at that stage, we'd had no opportunity to work on kick chase or how to be onside at a kick. Half of the boys probably didn't even realise you were allowed to kick. So we would just run it. And so we ended up being this kind of rogue team who did kind of nothing that anyone was expecting. And I think that undid quite a few of those teams who liked to know what was coming next, who liked to know, okay, well, we're in this area of the field, so this is what's likely to happen next. And all of a sudden, nothing that they were expecting would happen. And maybe kind of that was difficult for them. And I've definitely taken that into my coaching going forwards from that experience of just realising how effective it was as a form of attack, that if the opposition don't know what's coming, they're always going to be second to the races. They're always going to have to be chasing their tail in terms of what they've got to do. And because we were quite unpredictable and there was no structure, there was no organisation, there was no way you could kind of identify, okay, well, we need to try and do this and we need to try and do that, because they didn't know what was coming next to have to know what to deal with. So almost that not having facilities, not having the opportunity to train, not doing the expected ended up becoming one of our strengths. And I suppose the rest was just a bit of raw athleticism and dogged determination. And yeah, the boys turned up thinking, yeah, we're gonna kind of put on a good show and do our best. And that desire to want to do well and to want to be the best you can be, that I think that's quite innate. I think that's something that you can encourage, but I don't think you can put it into a player necessarily.
So you've got you could. I mean, it could be that something about the environment within which those young players grow up sort of fosters or nurtures some of those elements. So there might be an innate component, like you say, but equally it could also be to do with the fact that there is, look, I mean, I probably don't want to over egg this pudding, I suppose, but you know, some of those kids, I suppose, are growing up in environments where, you know, they are surrounded by social behaviors that are pretty, you know, kind of undesirable in the grand scheme of things, and there's a survival mechanism. Some of them have got family scenarios whereby, you know, they're having to grow up really pretty damn quick, aren't they? Again, I don't want to over egg it, but
no, I think it's true, because I think we talk a lot at the moment now about things like self-organisation, and a lot of those kids were very self-organised because they had no choice. A lot of them had been very used to doing things off their own back. I certainly remember when I suggested to the kids when they sort of first joined in year 7, look guys, I coach at Old Ruts, this is where it is, this is how you get to it, do you guys want to come down and play? If they turned up, I knew they'd turned up because they'd made that decision. They'd wanted to do it. They'd got on however many buses it was going to take, or they'd got to school when I turned up in the school minibus to pick anybody up that wanted a lift. And I knew they were doing that off their own back. And if they'd forgotten anything, it's because they had genuinely forgotten it, not because their parent had forgotten it for them or because somebody hadn't done it for them. And they only ever really did that once. If they forgot their gum shield, they would still turn up, they would still play, and they would then think, crikey, I don't want to do that again without a gum shield. And so they never forgot their gum shield again. Equally, if they forgot their boots, they would play in their normal shoes. And so that self-organisation, I suppose, was inflicted on them, I suppose, because they had no choice. They had to do it. And as a result, that did bring out some good characteristics in those kids, because there was that absolute resilience, there was that absolute dogged, doesn't matter how many times you put me down, I'm going to get back up again. And in a game of rugby, that happens a huge amount, either because you're not as good as the opposition or because you don't have the answers to some of the problems. There was never a miss, what do we need to do next? It was, they just sort of thought, right, okay, I'm going to take this into my own hands, or I'm going to find a way of doing this. And as conventional or as unconventional as it might have been, they would often kind of just do that themselves rather than look for anybody else. Because I suppose for some of them, they were in an environment where they didn't have a lot of people to turn to. So they were used to doing things for themselves. And maybe that's some of the difficulties that we have with some children at the moment now, is that in a parent or coach's quest to get them as good as they can be as early as possible, is actually you're almost taking away some of those opportunities that they might have otherwise had to have worked out that problem themselves. I often used to say to parents when I did talks at the club, was, what's the worst that's going to happen if they don't do something? So what's the worst that's going to happen if they turn up without their boots? What's the worst that's going to happen if they turn up without a water bottle? And you stepping in and preventing them from making those mistakes isn't actually necessarily going to help them learn from them. And some people might call me harsh. Some people might sort of say, well, yeah, where do you draw the line? But you know, as a coach and as a human being, kind of actually what's really important and what's not, what's safe and what's unsafe. But yeah, getting those kids to develop that self-organisation and that resilience can often be all of the things that you decide to do or not to do off the pitch. They're often very unrelated to what you do from a rugby perspective. They're to do with the kind of the culture and the characteristics that you build within your team through conversations and actions and stuff off the pitch. And and they're often the things that maybe people don't talk about quite so much.
It's the central thesis of the talent equation you've just described there perfectly, which is how too often, well, if we are looking at the idea of, any sports person, if they are going to go on some sort of journey of development, is going to need to be self-organizing. They're going to need to have resilience. They're going to need to be able to kind of navigate what is going to be a pretty demanding journey, and they've got to have that kind of determination, doggedness. It's a characteristic that almost without exception, every single, kind of elite sports person has. And I firmly agree that you described it as harsh. I don't think it's harsh at all. I think what's harsh is to rob children of the opportunity to develop some of those characteristics by trying to solve all the problems for them. And like you say, never giving them it's never giving them the opportunity to be able to solve some of those problems for themselves.
Yeah, I think I would go as far as to say, obviously a lot of people celebrated the fact that we got to the NatWest finals, but for me, the best thing that ever happened to those kids was losing in that final. They didn't think it at the time. There were tears and there was a lot of disappointment, and for some of them it was the first time that their parents had come to watch them play and all that kind of thing, and they'd had haircuts and all this kind of thing for it. It was a big moment for them. They were teenage boys, but the best thing that happened to them was that they lost, and they lost to a team that they know they could have beaten. To take nothing away from our opposition, they were lovely and they were better on the day than us. But that's the exact point of it. They were better on the day than us, and you look at the Premiership at the moment now and how close it is, and some of the deemed sort of upsets, if you'd like to say, but I don't think there are upsets. I think it's just who is going to be better on the day, and whether that's dealing with weather conditions, what the opposition throw at you. But for me, that loss was so significant that it formed the kind of the basis for a lot of their characters going forward, because for some of them, they kind of thought, actually, it means so much to me. This is clearly a game I want to stay involved in. And would they have had that if they'd kind of just cruised to victory? And would it have been as significant? And I don't think it would have done. I certainly don't feel that I would have learnt as much as a coach had we won that game, because A, I learnt a lot more about my players. B, I learnt a lot about just that process that brought and how we dealt with it afterwards. And equally, I know we often try and kind of protect our players from losing, because we think, they might not love rugby as much, or they might go and join another team, or whatever it is. But we went back to Old Ruts after that game, and about 15 minutes after we'd been there were lots of parents there were lots of other wider members of the club community there, and within about 15 minutes I realised that there was not a single boy around, and I kind of suddenly got a bit worried and thought, God, where have they all gone? And when I went looking for them, I walked past the big doors to go outside, and they were out there, all 22 of them. 11 of them had blazers on, and 11 of them were in their white shirts. So they were playing shirts v blazers, with a typical rolled up blazer on either end of the try line. And they were playing a game of touch in their full school uniform. So you kind of think to yourselves, actually, most kids just want to play. And the result might be important to the adults. And at the time, the result is important to the kids as well. But it's not a kind of irreversible process. It's not something that they're going to kind of dwell on and rue what they did wrong and that kind of thing. The kids just ultimately, they want to be with their mates and they want to play. And that's exactly what they were doing. And for those boys, that was their way of dealing with the fact that they'd lost on the biggest scale possible at that age. And they just kind of got on with it. And I think too often we as adults preempt that children are going to react really negatively to losing, but I think it's a massively positive thing for them to experience, because it just means that the next time they're not so worried about it. They're not so under pressure, because they know that life still goes on. You still sort of do everything you did beforehand after that match. Nothing really changes.
Which it's a really good point, actually, about the value of competition, and the value of the outcome of the competition. I think that's and that's really important. But obviously, the context here matters, because when you enter into a formal competition structure like you did and you progress through rounds and get to finals, then obviously outcomes become more prevalent. But the problem is that too many people I hear, and there's obviously this debate going on about the whole winning and losing in sports scenario, and there's too many people out there, in my view, who are saying, well, actually that should apply to 7-year-old kids as well. They need to really learn about the value of losing. And I'm like, whoa. They need to learn. They love competing and they can value competing, but actually we don't necessarily be throwing winning and losing at them and getting adults all crazy about cups and shields, because actually that can come later on, because your kids are in sort of, those kids were sort of in later teenage years. They're 14, 15 years old. So actually they've got an entirely different mental set of tools to be able to use, and when it comes to evaluating those kinds of experiences. So, and the context matters. Participation experience, actually, do we really want to be that focused on the outcome? But in that experience, that's exactly what we've gone in for. We've gone into a formal competition. So actually that's a totally different experience, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it's not necessarily the outcome that always matters, because I think even in competitions where people don't keep the score, the kids ultimately have a good idea themselves. They know who's won, they know who's lost. Yeah. It's what importance you put on that as an adult. Yes. It's if you're getting in the car with your kid and the first question you're asking them is, did you win? Did you score? And then the kid feels that there's potentially an importance that you've put on that, or that's what your measure of success is. For me, I think winning and losing happens all the time in life. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think when it directs adult behaviour amongst young people, then I think it can be really, really detrimental. And I remember I sat on the committee as the state schools representative for the age grades competition review, which I know you and
that was the prize you won, wasn't it? Hey?
Yeah, there we go. All those committee meetings, there it is. And I remember sitting in that thinking, the only thing that's changing in all of this is we're trying to change adult behavior ultimately, and adult behavior is often the kind of the thread that runs through a lot of issues, because simply by changing conversations that you have, or simply by changing what it is that you're measuring as your success within a game, that can completely change what the players feel is important for them to be focusing on. And if you only ever talk about score lines or who scored the most goals, or the stats of who's been the most valuable player, then I think you overlook things like effort, character, determination, which are things that ultimately you end up relying on in those big moments when they're older, because that's ultimately the defining part of their character and them as a player. And so it's definitely around kind of, as adults, what messages are we giving to those children? So at 7 years old, do they need to be worrying about whether they're playing for the best team in their league, or whether they're playing to try and win a cup final? Most of those kids are doing what my kids did at 14, 15, which is what we're having to eat afterwards. And they want to be playing with their mates. And that doesn't mean that you're not encouraging them to be competitive. It doesn't mean you're not encouraging them to want to win, because that is a massive trait as well. But it's how you do it, and it's how you're mindful of the experience that they have along the way. Are you looking after them as an individual? Are you caring for them as a whole child, rather than just seeing them as a player, or seeing them as an asset, or a kind of material product within your organization? And I just think that's such an important thing to focus on with young people in sport, is how can we encourage that by the behaviours that we're demonstrating, and by some of those conversations. And we recently had Richard Shorter in from the Non-Perfect Dad into the school that I'm at now at Trinity. Yeah. So he came into Trinity and did a workshop with our parents, and the parents just absolutely loved the information that he was giving them. And I mean, we're really fortunate at Trinity that we don't have shouty parents on the sideline. We don't have parents that try and get involved in the coaching. We have a really, really supportive group of parents. But even then, they wanted to know kind of what's good to say to my child when they're in the car on the way home, and how much do you kind of encourage that competitive spirit? How much do you let them kind of be disappointed after a game if they feel they haven't performed well, and that kind of thing? And those for me are things that as a coach I would most look to develop as an individual, because I think they're more important than how many cones can I put out at training the next session, or how many times are we going to score against a certain team. I would rather those boys sort of say, yeah, actually this is what we feel is important, this is what we feel we want to work on, and get them to come up with those kind of ideas. And too often I think we don't give young kids enough credit. I think so. I do quite a bit of coach education for the RFU and deliver the England Coaching Award course, and so often I'm asked by parents things like, what should I be doing at training, and what drills should I do, and we make suggestions like, well, have you ever asked the players what they want? Oh no, I coach the under-9s, so it will be chaos. And you kind of think it's quite a small-minded approach, really, in terms of we're automatically saying that 9-year-olds don't know how to design a game, or they don't know what they're good and not good at within a game. And I think actually if you just left them alone and you saw them playing in the playground, or you saw them playing at break time or lunchtime, I'm pretty sure there's some rules in there. I'm pretty sure that if there was a dispute, they would resolve it, and they would know who were the best players and who needed to do what, and who was good at what, and who might have areas to improve on. And I think they could do all of that without adults, if I'm honest.
Well, I mean, you're kind of proof of the pudding, aren't you? I mean, just to sort of kind of draw a line under that conversation a little bit about that kind of sports experience. I just think that for anybody thinking that, to reduce the sports experience down to essentially a score line takes away an awful lot of what sport's about and the richness of the sports experience. And I think your point about not only the kids deciding what's important for them, but that process of going through, of almost just asking those questions around, kind of what is it that we can get out of. And you made this point about measurement. We tend to only measure, firstly, coach performance on score lines. We tend to measure, the participant experience based on score lines, i.e., a winning team in inverted commas is better. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's a better experience because they're winning. Well, that could definitely not be the case. I've had winning teams that I coached that I don't think they had a very good experience back in the day during my wilderness years. So I definitely think that we have to think about kind of, I think importantly, what is the sports experience that we're trying to create? What is the environment we're trying to create for these individuals? I do want to kind of circle back a little bit, because they say that necessity is the mother of invention. So I think in your case, on your coaching journey, so what's really interesting, and I don't know whether you meant to say this or not, but obviously with the team that you first started with Kyle, that got you in the kind of on the rugby coaching journey, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Obviously, like I think you've probably been a bit harsh on yourself saying that you were just there to drive the bus and fill the bottles. But anyway, so you are at the very least co-creating an environment, or co-creating a rugby experience with the participants, one of whom happens to have a great deal of experience and can take a bit more of a lead than others, right? So in that scenario, you are absolutely immersed in the learning journey with them by necessity, right? Some really interesting research out there, a guy called Dominic Orth, that talks a lot about how coaches could conceive of themselves as being nested within the learning experience with the participants, and a learner alongside the participants, as opposed to somebody on sort of over the top directing the activity, and the one who knows, the knower of information that can, like a puppet master. I'm one. And actually, embedding yourself with the learners as a learner, learning with them, co-creating with them, and all that sort of stuff. That was brought to you by necessity due to the fact that you had no knowledge. So you're there. But interestingly, you then said that, 3 or 4 years later, you're now coaching at a club, you're doing more, and you've got a different group, and you take a different group on a journey, and yet whether it's by choice or by just this has happened to be the style you wanted or whatever it might be, you've sort of decided to stay there. You've said, I'm going to be a learner with them. I'm not going to be the one who creates structure and order. You're not. So you chose that. Why? What's that a bit about? I don't know whether you've even thought about that before.
I suppose I haven't really thought about it like that. I don't feel like I don't think it's about me. I'm in this sport because I want to help those young people. I want to provide a good experience for them, and therefore they are at kind of the center of everything that goes on. And whatever my behavior is or whatever my actions are, we talk about kind of measures of success and outcomes. Surely as a coach, if you measure your own success, I would say, right, out of the boys that I'm coaching now, how many of them are still playing in 10 years time? How many of them have children and want to get their children involved in rugby? How many of them, when they call time on their playing career, decide to stay involved in the sport and to put something back because they feel it brought so much to them? That for me is the ultimate goal. Maybe other people are different because they might have aspirations to coach at a higher level. I absolutely love coaching at grassroots level. I love making a difference. I love being involved in getting people involved in the sport and then actively doing something to keep them involved in the sport. I don't know whether I'd have that same enjoyment if I went kind of higher up the coaching chain, but equally, some of the coaches that I respect the most higher up that coaching chain have that kind of quite similar attitude as well. I do think that the higher up you go, the performance indicators change, and maybe if you're kind of accountable to people, or you get into the realms of you've got CEOs and sponsors and people like that, I get that there are different pressures. But if you're not in that professional environment, then ultimately your only important stakeholders are your players. And second to them, kind of almost on the same level for me, are your volunteers, because everybody that makes a difference to people have made a conscious decision to do that, or that's just kind of inherently in their character to be that way. But they're the people that everybody remember. If you go and talk to anybody and you ask them who their favourite teacher was when they were at school, or who the most influential person's been in their life, it's often not someone who's being paid based on the success of anything other than creating good human beings or creating people who are ultimately successful. And teachers, the most memorable teachers for me are always the ones who got to know me the best, or who had a real vested interest in, was I doing what I wanted to do? Was I happy in what I was doing? And they're the ones that you really remember, because they're the ones that have such a significant impact on your life, because they care. And caring about people for me is kind of such an important part of coaching. So I suppose I just see myself as, like, if you had a massive ship and you've got a little rudder at the back that just steers things in the right direction, that would be what I would want to be. I wouldn't want to be like the engine. I think that you've got to create from within. I think the players have got to be the ones that are standing there kind of steering the steering wheel and taking it where they want to go. And you're just the one that facilitates it. You're just the one that allows it to happen. And I think the only time you really step in is if you think they're really going down the wrong path, or you think they're really kind of making a bad choice that's ultimately going to have some consequences for them, potentially, I don't know, from a social or behavioural perspective, or if it's going to impact or harm other people. But otherwise, just let them be driven. And I think the learning experience is so much greater for them, because it's got a deeper importance to them, and anything that's important to you, you always work harder at, and anything you enjoy, you always try harder at. So I don't see where, particularly from a young person's perspective, where the emphasis on anything other than that is going to get you a better outcome than if you stick to the things that are really matter and really important to those individuals.
The irony, not irony, it's not even ironic, but the interesting thing, I think, too, that I'm reflecting on listening to that, I mean, you said a couple of really interesting things, like, I don't think it's about me. Well, I actually think that's quite quite a big statement that I think some people, probably not people listening to this podcast, but some people in the coaching journey would probably go, "Wow, really?" And then also this other thing, the only important stakeholders are your players. You made me think of a conversation I had recently with Chris Paniotto, who said, connection. We want connection, not correction. And too often we're thinking about the performance side rather than the actual personal side. The interesting thing about this for me, though, is, and I think this is the crux of the matter, is you as somebody who play alongside these groups and allowed them to solve problems for themselves. Not if this wasn't necessarily the rationale at the time, but by allowing that to happen, not only do they have a better experience for themselves, at least I believe so, but they've actually gone and played pretty well as well. So actually, ironically, when the instinct is to try and put structure, order, planning, do this, do that, in this situation, do this, in this situation, do that, and we are the knower and we can tell them. And in actual fact, by placing yourself alongside them as the learner and kind of asking questions, I guess, and giving them experiences, environments to explore within, and letting them come up with novelty and innovative approaches and things that otherwise probably people wouldn't see. And then lo and behold, wow, here we go. All of a sudden you've got performers doing things that wouldn't normally happen. And for me, that's innovation, that's creativity. You're creating a space for creativity to thrive. And I know in rugby, we talk a lot. I was part of the process of coming up with their cards model around, creativity and awareness and resilience and decision-making and self-organization. And you've adopted a methodology aligned to that. And you see benefits, not only in terms of the way the athletes connect with either you and themselves, but also in the way that they perform. So if anything, for me, it feels to me like this is a great big billboard for that approach.
Yeah, we obviously had success relative to kind of our starting point, and that starting point was probably maybe a little way off what other people's starting point might be. But I just don't think you can get it wrong if you're just giving the players the tools that they need when they go on the pitch. Because so often you hear success stories about people who are self-taught. So I would say if you did a poll on some of the world's richest people, and you looked at what their background was and how many of them created their own wealth or their own success, they wouldn't say it's because they bought the How to Become a Billionaire textbook and studied every chapter and did exactly what was said. I would say that they found an opportunity, or they found a loophole, or they found something that they thought could have been done better, and they trusted their instincts. They went with their gut. They probably got it wrong a lot more than they got it right, but the benefits were that when they got that success, you had that kind of eureka moment. So I know in teaching and in schools, they talk about the learning pit, and they talk about kind of allowing players to get to that end goal by themselves, because then they have real ownership of it, and it's so much more important for them. But if you look at so many of the successful people in this world, they haven't had it easy. They've not had a really seamless journey. There's not been you couldn't write a blueprint for how to be a successful, whether that's millionaire, professional in a career or not. It's so often down to the individual. And if you asked 100 of those people, I'd say 99% of them would say they learnt more from when they failed. They learnt so much from when they got it wrong. And the opportunities came from when they created things and had that kind of resilience. I'm going to stick at it. I'm going to keep going, even though it feels like there's barrier after barrier to try and to sort of that might stop me from getting where I want to get to. And they didn't give up. I don't think any of them would say, oh yeah, it's because I had somebody telling me at every single turn, at every single decision, what I should and shouldn't do, and then shouted at me when I got it wrong, and told me that because I didn't get it right on my first attempt, that I might as well not bother the 99 other attempts that I'm going to make in my lifetime. So that for me is almost the same in rugby. It's why would you hinder that that child's kind of probably innate desire to want to be successful, but to then have to find a way of doing that themselves, or to have to overcome some hurdles to get to where they want to get to, because then it's so much more meaningful. It will mean so much more to them.
That's a really important point, I think, that is often lost, which is we're often robbing them by attempting to solve problems, and by solving problems, I mean sometimes that is giving solutions. You mentioned tools. You said, I think you said, you can't get it wrong if you give the players the tools to do it for themselves. That's key. So it's not necessarily saying, here's the tool, here's the solution, here's the technical solution. You're giving them the ability to be able to find a way to solve a problem. So it's the problem solving skills that they're getting, because they're having to do that by necessity. Now, if we prevent that by providing solutions. So, obviously one of the theses of this podcast is, how can we create a learning environment that asks the players to solve problems and work with them and guide them on that problem solving journey? My father was a marine pilot, so he used to go out, get on a ship and guide it into a port, because the captain of the ship didn't necessarily know the tides and the reefs and everything else. But the way he did it wasn't to say to the captain, drive the ship like this. It was there to say to the captain, to give the captain the information the captain might need when coming up to a particular moment. Because, for example, in this scenario here, the tide's going to shift, so you're going to have to move the ship in this kind of way. So he's guiding the captain, but he's not telling the captain how they drive the ship. He's just giving him the guidance he needs to be able to navigate and manage the turbulent waters and this, that, and the other. So it's a similar process, really. I describe coaching like a navigational process. But in the training world, I can't be on the ship with them in a competition. So in the training world, that's the only place we've got. If I tell them what to do in the training world, but I can't do that in the competition world, I can't be on the pitch with them telling them what to do, well, there's a massive incongruence between those two things. And therefore, coaching effectiveness, in my view, must be limited by that. So I just think it's really interesting creating this learning environment that then also the benefit of that is it also gives it meaning, because it's something that they have had to work to solve. The learning pit, there's value in the struggle, isn't there? We're always trying to say, oh, this is too hard, I'm going to change it. Or this is too hard, let me tell you what to do or show you what to do. No. Actually, sometimes it might be too hard, but actually sometimes there's some value in that struggle. Let's stay there for a little while, see what emerges. And that's sometimes where those amazing eureka moments come from.
Yeah, I think you get loads more from an experience like that than you would winning a game 80-0 or something like that, because what are those learning opportunities? Where have they come from? Going back to kind of that environment, I suppose, is if you took somebody like me at the beginning of my coaching journey who knew nothing about the game, who knew nothing about kind of what a coaching session would look like, in my view, if you'd said to the completely naive, non-rugby experienced me, what would a player need to get better, then I probably would have said to you, a bit of grass, a ball, and an opponent. and I think it's as simple as that, because I definitely wouldn't have said to you, oh, could you give me like a rectangular bit of foam that people can just run into and stand in lines waiting their turn? Because I'd sort of be saying, well, that's like me being a diver, and you sort of saying to me, right, well, okay, how good's your use of a hockey stick or something? It's just completely irrelevant to what you'd see in a game. And I think from a coaching perspective, it totally comes down to that. It's what are they going to need in a game, and therefore let's work out again what those tools are that they're going to need to be able to solve the problems in a game. And if you come up and if you come into a game and you realize there's a problem that you haven't got a solution for, you've got to replicate that problem, and you've got to then sort of get those players, first of all, to recognize what the problem is, potentially before that recognize that there is a problem, what that problem might be, and then sort of find out, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? Just in exactly the same way as you would in other walks of life. It's a really simple concept. And I think so often it's us as coaches and particularly adults who really overcomplicate that process, because we might know in our heads what the solution should be, or what it could be, or from our previous playing experience or coaching experience, what we think the solution might be. And we then try and get them to go from 1 to 10 without touching steps 2 to 9 in between, because we're ultimately trying to coach them to get through, to get to an end goal, rather than the importance of the process that happens in between, because often it's the process that will then allow them to apply that process to the next problem that they might overcome. And if it was possible to be the best team in the world and for no one to beat you, then we wouldn't have competitive sport, because I suppose the All Blacks are as close as you get to the sort of the most unbeaten team, but even they're beatable. And how often do you get teams who win the Premiership year after year after year after year? I would say, because you don't get that now, that's a sign that coaching's getting better, because if there was one answer if there was one solution to every problem, then once you found that kind of that magic equation, you wouldn't have coaching, you wouldn't have competitive sport. And it's a live environment. It's with human beings who are unpredictable, and therefore there is never going to be a set equation that you could write down that's going to be the key to them solving every problem in the game. Therefore, the best tool and the best advice you can give them is the ability to solve those problems themselves. And that comes from recognizing them in the first place, understanding the impact that they're having, and then understanding that there is an infinite number of solutions to that problem. There isn't just one. It isn't just what you were taught to do when you were a young rugby player 20 years ago. It's okay, well, what does that solution look like right now? And you might end up with that same problem in 5 or 6 games over whatever period of time. They could be on consecutive weeks, but every single week they'll be different, because the size of the opposition player, the speed of the opposition player will change, the weather conditions will change, the referee will change. So therefore, the likelihood of you ever being in exactly the same situation, in exactly the same scenario ever again, must almost be nil. Therefore, it's great when you get a team who are very organised and very structured, and I see that there can be benefit to that. But if there was real benefit to that, then surely the team who practiced the most, were the most structured and the most organised, would be unbeatable.
So the best example I could use as far as that's concerned, I totally agree with, by the way. I mean, the quest, there is a quest for sustained performance. I get that, because in high performance, that's what people are looking for. But the irony is, I think that the methods people use on the quest for sustained performance actually end up being working directly opposite what their actual goal is. And that's the irony of that whole process, and I've certainly been in that space. But the interesting thing for me is, if you take starlings as an example, flocks of starlings, nobody gets groups of starlings as young starlings and gets them into flocks and says, now, by the way, when Joey Starling turns left, you're going to have to turn left too, because if you don't, then you're going to run into Jenny Starling over here, and then they're going to crash. They don't do that. They co-adapt all the time. And if you want to create opportunities for young people to be able to create that co-adaptation, you have to give them the opportunities to experience what it might mean for them to co-adapt together. I'm going to work with that person, they're going to do these things, and in this moment they might do these things, and in a similar moment like this they might do these things, and I'm going to begin to intuitively understand that, and then we're going to become a bit more cohesive as far as that's concerned. But that's very, very different from what happens most of the time, which is a game plan, right? Yeah. Which maps everything out in perfect order. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do this. When you hear coaches saying we lost our shape, what that means is we're in a chaos.
Don't get me started on things like that.
Well, this is why I'm dangling a carrot for you to just go. So it's like, we lost our shape. Basically, that's code. Well, they don't really, two things. Firstly, it's a damning indictment on their own coaching. But secondly, it's code. And what it means is we're not able to cope in chaotic situations, which is an indictment on my coaching because I haven't provided enough chaotic situations for my players to be able to try and experience and navigate and survive within. And therefore, we have not succeeded in our quest here today. And hello, press, that's on me. They don't say that. They just say, we lost our shape.
Yeah, probably in the red zone.
All the language is great, isn't
it?
So,
interestingly, like when you were saying that, I was thinking about a lad that we've got at school, and he's just a really interesting character, and I've never come across somebody like him before. He's only young. He's in his first year at the school, and I don't know what his coaching background's like. He's quite talented in terms of he's pretty good at most sports that he turns his hand to. But the most interesting fact about him, and everybody that knows him will know exactly who I'm talking about as soon as I start describing this, is we don't know what position he is. We don't know what position he's going to be. And we don't kind of put them in any positions. We just let them choose where they want to play. And most of the time, the teams are pretty self-selected. And during the game, it can change enormously depending on who's doing what. But this player, he sees, you actually you can physically see somebody else do something that you as a coach know you've never seen him do. Now, I know he didn't play rugby before he came to the school, so I know it's not that we've only seen him do certain things. And you see him watch somebody do something that you've never seen him do before. And it could be from his own team or it could be from the opposition team. And bearing in mind this child is 11, you then see him just randomly within the game trying what that person's done. So he's obviously got a mental picture in his head of, oh, I really like what that person did. Now, whether he likes it because he thinks that looks really fun to try, or whether he looks at that and thinks that was really successful, whatever that is, he sees something in that moment and thinks, I fancy giving that a go. And you see him give it a go in the game. So he's clearly got kind of no inhibitions about whether he can do it, whether he's going to get it wrong or not, which I love about the kind of the environment that we've created, that he feels safe enough to do that. But generally, by the end of the game, he's kind of mastered it. And so you look at that and you think, why as a coach would I even get involved at that stage, other than to maybe say to him as he's walking off, I really like the way you tried that, or I really enjoyed the way that you did X, Y, and Z.
Does that include, so when you say he's mastered it, does that include kind of knowing the kind of moment within which that might be appropriate versus not, or is it just more
with certain things,
the movement down?
No, with certain things. So it could be a type of tackle, or it could be being able to keep the ball alive in a certain situation. And we know that it's definitely not information that's come from us as coaches. But we know that he's just seen it, because we will have seen it whether we're refereeing or standing at the sideline watching. We will have seen somebody else do it first. And you can almost bet money on the fact that before the end of the game or before very long, you're going to see him trying that. And
I've got a couple of kids like that.
Yeah. And that's the epitome of it for me, of what children will do kind of if they're just left to their own devices, or if they're not standing there thinking, I wonder what we're going to be told to do next, or I'm wondering whether what I just did was right or wrong. Because if you leave them to their own devices, their definition of whether it was right or wrong will probably end up looking something like, well, did it benefit my team or me? Did I end up scoring a try or going forward, or being successful as a result of it? Or as simple as, did I enjoy it? Did I enjoy doing that?
Yeah,
it might have been rubbish. It might not have worked, but actually I had a great fun in an attempt at doing it.
It's kind of the team sport, the team sport equivalent of, like, how kids learn tricks in skateboard parks. They see somebody else do something cool, and then they give it a go, and then sometimes somebody else helps them out, but generally speaking, they go away and give it a go. I've got a kid. I've got a few of them actually, but there's one in particular who I'm thinking of as a particular moment where he was trying this kind of, in a hockey context, like a backhand hit. And the sort of conventional way of doing it is you kind of put your stick quite low to the ground and you should use the sort of bladed edge of the stick, and it gives you quite a lot of power and direction, etc., etc. He didn't have that because we don't do techniques. we try and solve problems. But he had this problem that he was on the left side.
He'll never catch on.
Never catch on. No, I know. It's bunkum, isn't it? It's complete witchcraft. He said he was on the left side and he had to get the ball across, and he didn't want to turn around because he wanted to do it as he was running, and so he was trying to hit it with his upright, and there's very little surface area on the stick to use, and it's quite awkward. It's on the wrong. It's conceived of the wrong side. Feels, to somebody who's kind of used to hitting on the other. Anyway, so he had a couple of goes at this and missed the ball a few times. So I called him over and just said, "I love that. That's something for you to go away and practice." Now, that was just to give him that moment of there you go. There's your garden thing. There's your homework. And he then did it. And I was kind of suggesting to him sort of that's something that maybe he might not do now because he needs to go away and practice it, sort of. I wasn't actually saying that, but I was sort of. Yeah. So he just went and did it and just smashed it. And then just to prove that it wasn't a fluke, did it again. And I'm like, there you go. That's the environment, in it. They're the moments.
Yeah, for sure.
So I could talk to you all day, and there is a lot more to talk about, but it's going to have to be a part 2 because my 7-year-old just walked in from gymnastics and has got plenty to tell me about her gymnastics experience.
I'm sure.
But anyway, listen. Loved having you on, and I'm really glad we could do it.
Thank you.
Sorry I've taken up so much of your Friday evening.
It's fine.
But it's a great story. I mean, if people want to reach out to you and maybe want to maybe get them to come, they might want to get you to come and tell your story and talk at an event or whatever it might be. And I know that you are great at that as well. You are great at a lot of things, and it's annoying, but there you go. You're one of those people. But anyway, where can they find you?
So on Twitter, at Stacialong, which is STACIALONG, or they can, I'm sure, contact by you to get my contact details. I'm director of rugby at Old Ruts Rugby Club, so my contact details are on there. And yeah, it'd be cool to hear from anyone who might be interested or just wants to just have a chat.
The gymnast has arrived. She's come to chat. Say hello.
Hello.
This is Isla. Say hello to Stacia.
Hi.
Just say hi. You okay? Right, run along and I'll be with you in a minute. Okay. Anyway, sorry. Thank you for that. She loves an audience. Trust me.
Oh, bless her.
She does.
We'll make a diver out of her soon. Don't worry.
Oh yeah, I think you might with her gymnastics and everything.
There we go.
She has learned to dive. It's kind of an interesting. It's more like a forward roll into the pool, but it works.
That's cool. Yeah, it's a good start. I got quite a long way doing that. That's my speciality.
Well, that is definitely something to circle back to because I think that's a really interesting piece of space. That's an interesting space. Anyway, do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh no, absolutely brilliant to have you on, and all the best with everything you're carrying on doing on the ongoing learning journey.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.
So there you have it. How good was that? Oh, what a story that is. What a fantastic journey. I have to say, like I said at the start, I've known Anastacia for a while, and I knew about this story, but I didn't know the detail of it. And actually, the more she was talking and sort of almost like peeling back the layers, the more excited I became just listening to, everything that she's done and all the experiences that she's had and the backstory. I certainly didn't know about the backstory about the team. And the death of their teacher and how that affected them, and that's wow, just wow. So much to take away from that. One of the big ones for me though is that this idea that their biggest strength was what they didn't have. No conventional ideas, no predictability, no set moves, not real structure, not really kicking the ball. All these sorts of things. They were playing. More from an instinct, from what's in front of them, and the fact that they didn't have a lot of the ideas already meant that they were constrained as such, and then had to go with what they saw, which is often what we're we're trying to do with the players. So fantastic story. Hope you enjoyed. There's a lot of people who join me in the conclave who have similar stories. So if you do want to join the conclave, we're meeting on Mondays at the moment, Monday evenings online, and there are a few spots available because some people have decided that they needed to they can't make it on a Monday or whatever it is. So come and join our merry throng. If you want to do that, head over to the Patreon button on the front page of the website, click become a patron, and you'll see there's an option to join the conclave, and it is open, so come and join, and it'd be great to have you on board. In the meantime, have a great week of coaching, and remember, ditch those drills.